In this video, we are going to update the news application that we have created in our last exercise. To update it, we have to do the following things. First, we have to display a loading indicator whenever we are fetching data. We have to handle errors like browser being offline or whenever the response is not okay. And in that case, we just have to display a friendly message. And at last, we have to use finally to remove the loading indicator that we were showing in the start. So here right now the application looks something like this. So when you refresh the page, it will wait for some second and display all the news one after another. And here we have multiple sources that you can select, and when you select that, it will display news only from that source. In this video, we are going to display some friendly messages whenever something goes wrong, or when we are loading data, or whenever we are loading any kind of data, we have to display a spinner. So first thing, let's just work on the spinner. So whenever you're loading data in the start, we need to display a spinner, and whenever loading is done, we have to hide it. So to create a spinner, I'm going to use a loading indicator from this website, 30 seconds of code, because it is very easy to copy and paste. So what we can do, I can copy this thing into our CSS file at the bottom, and this is the HTML we need to display a loading indicator. So I'll copy this and using JavaScript we'll put it into our HTML file. Now to display or hide the spinner, we are going to have a variable. So we'll define a variable to be isLoading, and in the starting it is going to be false. And whenever isLoading is true, you have to display the spinner. So to handle that, we are going to create a function we'll call handleSpinner. And what we need to do is, like, whenever the value of isLoading is true, we need to display the spinner inside news element, because that is our UL element. So what we'll do, we'll say news element dot inner HTML should be equal to this HTML here. You can create the element using document.createElement, but here, because we are not going to change this information, I'm just putting it like this for now. And this will only happen whenever the value of isLoading is true. So we'll say if isLoading is true, you have to call this function. And now we will decide when we are going to call this function. So let's see what is happening here. When you refresh the page, in the starting, it is going to fetch some data. And fetching data will take some time. So in that amount of time, we will have to do that. So here, first we are fetching data, converting it to JSON, using that value to do something. What if we convert this into a function? Then it will become a lot more easier. So we'll say init, and we'll put this fetch inside a function. And what we will do is, so rather than putting this fetch outside, we can put it inside a function and call it at the bottom. So here we can say init, just call this function. And here we know that whenever you initialize, you're going to display spinner, right? So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to change the value of isLoading to be true. And because the value of isLoading is true, what we can do, we can also call the function handleSpinner. And when you call handleSpinner, it will start displaying the spinner. So let's see what happens. So now if you refresh, you can see a spinner here, but after some second, the spinner is gone. So what is happening? So in the starting, the value of isLoading is false, and we are not calling this function. But we are calling this function right here when we are fetching data. So first thing we are doing is changing the value of isLoading to be true, and then calling handleSpinner. And then we'll go ahead, fetch data, data is fetched, converted to JSON, and what we need to do next is, so whenever data is fetched properly, we need to change the value of isLoading and call handleSpinner again. So we'll be like, the value of isLoading should be false and call handleSpinner. Even if we were not doing it earlier, it was working properly, is because in render news, we are clearing the inner HTML. So anyhow that is happening, but it is good if we can do it here. So now if you refresh it, things will work, spinner, it will take a bit of time, display the news, and it is working properly. So in that way, we have taken care of spinner. But there is one issue that we can fix right now, is like, why to have this variable outside when we can just put it inside the function? So rather than putting it outside, we can put it inside, and here we can take it as a parameter and we'll call it status. So it should not be isLoading, we'll say status, and status should default to false. Now, whenever you want to display the spinner, all you have to do is to call handleSpinner with the value of true. And whenever you call it without any value, it will default to false and it will not show the spinner. So that is what is going to happen. So now rather than having a global variable, we have a local variable to this function, and that is much better. So in that way, we have taken care of the loading spinner. But now when we refresh the page, we can see the spinner here, and at last the spinner is gone. We can also change the color of the spinner by changing it to black. Now when you refresh it, you'll see the spinner is black. You can also move it into the center. For that, what we can do here, we'll just create a div with a class of spinner, and we'll give that a text align of center. Now when you refresh it, you'll see it comes into the center. You can also make it flex, and we can say height is 100 VH, display flex, justify content center, align item center. Now when we refresh it, you'll see it will come in the center of the page. So wherever you want to display, you can display it. But now the loading indicator looks good. We need to move on to the next two part, where we have to display friendly message whenever the browser is offline or whenever the response is not okay. So let's take care of that. So here, to display the error, what we want to do is, so whenever there is any kind of error, neither I would like to display the options nor I would like to display the message. So we'll have to hide these two parts. So to hide it, it will be a lot more easier if we can just wrap them into a div. So this div will contain information whenever the data fetching is done properly. And I'll create another div, and that will be about handling or showing error. So we'll create a class error message. This one will have a class of main. So let's save this. So we have two div and we have to take care of that. So let's go ahead and select these two elements. So here we'll call it main, and to select that we'll say dot main, and this one is dot error message, and that is error element. Now we need to create a function similar to handleSpinner. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll create a function called handle error message that will accept a message. If you don't pass any message, it will fall back to something went wrong. And what we need to do here is, first we will have to hide main. So we'll say main dot style dot display should be equal to none. Whenever you're calling this function, it means that you have to display some kind of error, and whenever you're displaying error, you will have to hide this. And here for error element, we'll say error element dot inner text is going to be whatever message we're getting as parameter. So we'll save this. We'll try to call this and see if it is working or not. So we'll call this function here, refresh it, and here you can see the message something went wrong. We'll just go ahead and style it a bit. So we'll say error message will have a text align of center, margin top will be 4 rem, and color will be red. Refresh it, and here we have. So it can display the message. All we have to do is to call that specific function in different situations. So first situation is going to be whenever your browser is offline. So how you can mock that? So to mock that, you can go into network tab, and here you have a button network. You can go offline, and whenever you go offline and you go back to your browser and look for navigator.online, you'll see it is false. Whenever it is online, it will return online. So that is what we need to do. So here, when you take a look at how our application is starting, you can see that is happening with the help of init function. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to say navigator.online. If that is the case, that is the only time you should do that. If that is not the case, you have to display error message. So we'll put it inside. So here the error message we can send is check your internet connection. We'll save it and we'll see if it is working or not. Refresh this, and here you can see the message check your internet connection. But what happens when you go back to online? Now when we refresh it, it is back. But there is one problem, that we are having this extra margin on top. That should not be the case. The reason for that is because here we have error message and we are giving it a margin top of 4rem. So what we want is this element should not be visible if there is no error, right? So what we can do is we can make it display none. And here in handle error message, the first thing we need to do is say error element dot style dot display should be equal to block. So now when we refresh it, you can see that the margin is gone. So in this way, we have taken care of handling whenever browser is offline. We have to take care of the next kind of error, and that will be happening inside fetch. We know that whenever you say response.json, we know that fetch only throws error whenever there is no internet connection or any kind of course issue. It doesn't throw error when the response is not okay. So to handle that, what we are going to do, we are going to check if response.ok. It means that whenever the response is okay, you have to return response.json. Whenever the response is not okay, we will throw an error. So we'll say throw new error, response not okay. And here what we are going to do is we are going to add a catch statement. We haven't handled error of any kind. So here we'll say dot catch. Catch will get access to error message. And here we need to call this function handle error message with that error message that we're getting as parameter. So now when you refresh it, everything is working properly. Now what we need to check is what happens when we change the URL. So here instead of API, we are just going to say API with multiple I. Refresh it, and here you can see it is throwing an error saying response not okay. As soon as you come back to API, save it, refresh it, everything is working properly. So in this way, what we did is we created two functions, handleSpinner and handleErrorMessage. So handleErrorMessage is responsible for displaying error message whenever it happens. Now the point is, when does error happen? So first kind of error that we have taken care of is whenever the browser is not online. So that happens, so you have to throw a message saying check your internet connection. And the other error that can happen when you're fetching data. Naturally, the fetch function doesn't throw error whenever there is any kind of issue with the URL. It only throws error whenever it is a course issue or the browser is offline. So we also need to handle the case when response is not okay, and that is what we are doing here. And whenever that happens, we are checking if the response is not okay, you have to throw an error. And whenever fetch will throw error, it will be caught by this statement. And here we are saying, go ahead, call this function handleErrorMessage, and that will display error message. So in this way, we have updated our news application. One last thing what we can do here is we can put all of these things into a function called main, or we can just create a ify. Ify is immediately invoked function expressions. So you create a function like this, you put everything inside and you call them at the same time. So what happens with that is, so everything that was in global scope will go inside the scope of this function and will not have access to that specific thing. Now when you refresh it, the app will work properly, but when you want to get access to things like all news, you will not have access to it. One last thing that we have not done here is using finally to remove the loading indicator. So the situation for this kind of a case is, whenever you're fetching data, you have to display some kind of spinner. And whenever the fetching is done, it can either resolve or reject. So either it can go into .then or it can go into .catch. So in both these cases, what we need to do is to hide the spinner. So in this application, the way we have done that is by clearing the inner HTML. The other way what you can do is after catch, you can also use finally, and finally gets called no matter what. So it will be called either the promise is resolved or the promise is rejected. So in this case, what I need to do is whenever that happens, you need to hide the spinner. And how can you hide the spinner? So we'll say handleSpinner and we'll call it, and we'll call that function because handleSpinner defaults to false. So it will not display it anyway. So in that way, we have completed this exercise by showing and hiding loading indicator and displaying different messages in different circumstances.